So let's start with the first question from SharePoint questions and answers video series. What is SharePoint? SharePoint Foundation, and SharePoint Server. So in this video, what we will do is we'll first try to understand that why do we need SharePoint? What are these two terms, SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server? So let's go step by step. Now the biggest benefit of SharePoint is it increases organization productivity. Now in order to understand that how basically SharePoint increases organization productivity, we first need to understand that how basically typically an organization actually works. So let's first understand that how typically organization works, how people coordinate, what they do exactly. Now the most important thing in organization is people. So you have people with different roles. For example, probably you have a person who is a CEO of the company. Probably you have accountants. Probably you have a salesperson, or probably you have technicians, who help you execute projects or whatever it is, So there are people, and people have different roles in the organization. Now, as per the roles of each of these persons, they would be generating data. For example, the accountant must be maintaining all of its data in an Excel sheet. So all the balance sheets must be day-to-day journal entries are all entered into Excel sheet. The salesperson would be maintaining its presentations into PowerPoint presentation, into PPT files. The technical person would be documenting lots of his technical details into a Word document, right? The CEO of the company must be maintaining his data into email. So all of his data, all of his important conversations are stored into Outlook. So in this way, every person in the organization is generating data, and all these generated data are in different formats or are in different forms. Now, using this data which are in different formats, people would like to collaborate with each other. For example, probably the accounts department would like to send a daily sales report which is in Excel sheet to the sales department. The sales department would like to do a verification on that Excel sheet, and they would like to further send this Excel sheet to the CEO, and the CEO would like to make a final approval and give a green flag to the accounts department for further check clearance or whatever it is. So in other words, using this data which are in different formats, people would like to collaborate with each other, they would like to discuss with each other, and they would like to achieve certain goals of the organization. In simple words, what people want is they want one central point, from where everybody can share information and they can collaborate. So basically they want one point of contact or one central place, where everybody comes and posts his documents, then it goes via approval process, etc., etc. And that's what exactly SharePoint does for us. Now, as the name says, SharePoint. In other words, it's a central point in an organization, where people can share data, they can communicate, they can collaborate. Now, when I say central point, at the end of the day, this is a website. A central website, which can be a intranet portal or which can be an internet portal. So, defining what is SharePoint. SharePoint at the end of the day is a platform, which can be used by your organization people to connect, to collaborate, and to share data in a seamless manner. Now, the next question you would ask me is that, now, what will a developer do in this? Because when you say that people want to collaborate data, they want to share data, it looks, like this is mostly for the end users who are like accountants or who are like salesperson. So what is developer doing in this, or what is the role of the developer here? In today's world, business process, any business wants customized softwares. So customization is one of the important aspects, when we talk about software industry. Now, even though SharePoint, provides a ready-made platform, where people can share data, they can collaborate, they can communicate, but still people want to tailor this platform as per their requirements. And that's where exactly developers come into picture. What SharePoint does is SharePoint has exposed, his own APIs, or I can say rather in technical words, I'll say a SharePoint object model. Okay. And this object model we can consume in Visual Studio and tailor the complete SharePoint platform as per the new requirement or as per the requirements of your organization. So in other words, SharePoint exposes a complete object model which the developers can leverage and tailor and customize as per the current process. So now let's define SharePoint completely end to end. SharePoint is a platform where different kinds of people or different roles of people can share data, they can collaborate, and this platform can also be customized as per your current business process. So at the end of the day, SharePoint is nothing but it's a platform, where people can share data, they can collaborate, and we can also take this platform and customize the platform as per our needs. Now there are two flavors of SharePoint. The first one is SharePoint Foundation. Now the SharePoint Foundation is nothing but it's a free version. You don't have to pay any money for SharePoint Foundation. Now the second version of SharePoint is called as SharePoint Server 2010. Now this is the paid version of SharePoint. Now this SharePoint Foundation is nothing but it is your base framework. It is the base framework of SharePoint on which SharePoint Server 2010 actually stands. So you can think about that SharePoint Foundation is for basic requirements, while SharePoint Server 2010 is more of enterprise requirements or enterprise solutions. For example, if you want to really differentiate between SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server, let's just make a small table for comparison. So this is the SharePoint Foundation and this is the SharePoint Server. Okay. For example, let's say search. Now in SharePoint Foundation, you can do a basic search. For example, you can search within a document, right? You can search with a by using a text, by putting some and conditions or conditions. But in SharePoint Server, you can definitely do all these things. But addition to that, let's say that you want to search within a page, or let's say that you want to search throughout the site level search, or let's say that you want to search only in the user database, let's say, so you can, here like, the search requirement is very basic, but where else, if you look at SharePoint Server, the search requirement actually, it's a bit advanced, or it has more features, like on the page level, on the site level, or on the user database. The second point is Office integration. In SharePoint Foundation, we don't have a great Office integration actually. It's like very basic ones we have. You can view the document, etc. in Excel, etc. But it's not tightly integrated. But in SharePoint Server, what you can do is you can connect to the SharePoint Server by using Excel or Access or PowerPoint, etc. So all Office softwares, can act as a direct client, to your SharePoint Server. So you can use MS Access, you can use Excel, you can use PowerPoint, Word, to connect to Microsoft SharePoint Server, right? So that's one big difference between SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server. One of the other big differences is from the reporting aspect. In SharePoint Server, you can derive reports, of analytics of how many users have come to the site, from where, etc. In SharePoint Foundation, you don't have anything as such, from the aspect of knowing the analytics of the website. So in this way, there are endless, endless differences between SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server. But said and done, SharePoint Foundation is the core framework on which your SharePoint 2010 is actually extended. And definitely a free version is a free version, so definitely there should be a limitation on different services provided by the free version, and paid version is a paid version, so definitely you will have extra features on that. So before you initiate any project, what I will suggest is to look at the requirements and see that if the SharePoint Foundation is enough for it. In case SharePoint Foundation is enough for it, then probably you don't need to buy SharePoint 2010, right? Because definitely it is costly as compared to SharePoint Foundation 2010. So that's the first thing, that there are two different products in SharePoint, two major different products in SharePoint. One is the Foundation, which is a free version, and the other one is a SharePoint Server, which is a paid version. Now let's discuss about the different hardware and the software requirements we need for SharePoint to function properly. The first thing is your box, your machine. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the hardware first. Now, the hardware on which the SharePoint should be installed, should be minimum 4 GB RAM. It should have at least 80 GB hard disk, NTFS. Minimum it should be 2.5 gigahertz multi-core. When I'm saying 2.5 gigahertz, then this should be per core. So if you have dual core, then every core should at least perform perform with this rate of 2.5 gigahertz. And very important is, this hardware should be 64-bit compatible. Remember that now we don't get SharePoint in 32-bit. Okay, so we have either 64-bit or either nothing. So ensure that the hardware what you have should be 64-bit compatible. On this hardware, we need to install Windows Server 2008, 64-bit again. Remember, the 64-bit is very important. There is no installation for 32-bit. Okay, so that's a surprise which is there in SharePoint 2010. So Windows Server 2008, again 64-bit. And with this, don't forget to install IIS 7.0. So at the base, you have a hardware of 64-bit compatible with 4 GB RAM, 80 GB hard disk, dual core, multi-core, whatever it is. On this hardware, you need to install Windows Server 2008 64-bit and ensure that IIS 7.0 is also installed. Now in SharePoint, all the data gets stored into SQL Server. So in other words, you create a site, the configuration of the site, the data of the site, everything gets stored into SQL Server. So on the top of Windows Server 2008, you need to install SQL Server 2008, either Enterprise or Express Edition. Remember that if you're installing Express Edition, then it has a limitation of 4 GB. Probably, for the SharePoint site, that won't be enough on a long run. The next thing is, at the end of the day, SharePoint is a website, so it also needs ASP.NET. Now, once you have installed all these prerequisites, on the top of it, the first thing you need to install from SharePoint is the SharePoint Foundation, which we just discussed, in the previous section of the video. Without SharePoint Foundation, you cannot install SharePoint Server 2010. So because this is the core framework. And then on the top of this, in case you have paid money and you have bought SharePoint, then you can install SharePoint Server 2010. So that's the complete hardware and the software requirement for SharePoint. So if you want to minimally run SharePoint, these are the necessary requirements you need to fulfill. So in this video, what we did, in this video, we started first, with discussing why do we need SharePoint, and we defined SharePoint first. Then in the next section of the video, what we did is we talked about the two flavors of SharePoint, that is SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server, and we discussed the differences between them. And then finally, what we did is we talked about the hardware and the software requirement which we need for SharePoint. In the next video, we'll talk about how exactly is SharePoint architected. Because as I said that this complete video series is for developers. It is not for end users. Okay. So as a developer, what we are interested is we are interested in this API, this SharePoint object model which is exposed, which we can consume in Visual Studio. So if we know the structure of this API, then we can take better control of the SharePoint platform. So in the next video, we'll talk about the architecture of this API or of this SharePoint object model, and we'll see that how we can better use the same in our Visual Studio to customize the complete SharePoint platform. Thank you very much.